It is 1869, Cambridge, Massachusetts. The room is cold. A second-floor bedroom on Quincy Street, near the edge of the Harvard campus. There is a desk with a stack of medical texts on it. There is a lamp that is not lit. There is a young man who has not left this room in weeks. His name is William James. He is 27 years old. He has just completed his degree in medicine at Harvard. 6 years of study, examinations, dissections, the long grind of learning what the body is made of. He has a medical degree. He is qualified to practice. He has not gone to practice. He has sat in this room instead, staring at the desk, unable to decide which way to turn. This is not, as far as he can tell, a problem with the body. He has checked. He is a doctor, after all. He knows how to examine himself. The body is functional. The mind is not. And so he sits. And the thought that circles most often is the thought that should not. That perhaps nothing he does will matter. That perhaps there is no self at all that is capable of choosing. That the whole idea of a person who acts freely in the world is an illusion, and every movement he has ever made was just the universe moving through him. There is a word for this. He does not have it yet. The word is depression. In 1869, they would have said melancholia, a disorder of the will. Let your body settle. Whatever you brought into this night, you can set it here, at the door of this room. What follows is the story of the man who sat in that room and the way he found out of it. Not through certainty, not through a cure that arrived cleanly, through a choice made in the dark that rebuilt him over a decade. There are two kinds of tiredness you may be carrying tonight. One of them you know. The other is quieter and it sits deeper, and we will come to it. By the end of this night, you will know which one you have been carrying. The room does not answer. We begin in 1842. William James was born on January 11 in a hotel in New York City. His father, Henry James Sr., was a theologian of unusual intensity, a man who had once had a vision so terrifying that it left him unable to move for 2 days. He called it a vastation. It arrived one evening at a dinner table in Windsor, England, when William was 2 years old. The elder James looked up from his meal and felt the room fill with a presence he described as squatting in the corner, formless, malevolent, and waiting. He came out of it changed, and spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to him. William James grew up in a household of ideas. Dinner was an argument. Travel was constant. By the time he was 12, he had lived in New York, London, Paris, Boulogne, Newport, and Geneva. His French was as good as his English. He was also, by all accounts, almost impossible to keep in one place. His younger brother Henry, who would become one of the most precise novelists in the English language, described William as the kind of person the world was always too small for, restless, curious, in 6 directions at once, unable to stop turning things over. This distinction between the mind that watches from a careful distance and the mind that plunges in and needs to touch and test would eventually run through everything William James wrote. He did not trust a truth he had only read. He needed to feel it first. That need would cost him years of his life. It would also produce everything worth keeping from those years. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Just notice. Chapter 2. The river that never stops. There is a thing that happens in the mind between one thought and the next. Most people have never noticed it. William James spent 20 years trying to describe it. He called it the stream. Not a pool, not a set of blocks arranged in a row. A stream, continuous, flowing, always already moving into the next thing before the last thing has fully left. The thought you are having right now is already surrounded by the shadow of the thought that will follow it. The two are not separate, they overlap. They bleed at the edges. This was a radical idea in 1890. The dominant model at the time, the one coming out of the laboratories in Leipzig under Wilhelm Wundt, who had established the first formal psychology experiment in the world, was that the mind was a mechanism. You could take it apart, examine its components, measure its reactions. The mind, in this view, was a collection of discrete sensations assembled into experience. James disagreed. He had studied the Leipzig school, he respected the rigor, but when he looked at his own mind, which he did relentlessly, turning it like a stone in a stream, what he found was not a mechanism. What he found was something that refused to hold still. He wrote about it in The Principles of Psychology, a book that took him 12 years to complete and ran to nearly 1,400 pages in its first edition. He had promised his publisher it would take 2 years. The chapter on the stream of consciousness is, by any measure, one of the strangest and most honest things ever written about the mind. James tried to capture the experience of thinking as thinking actually happens, not as it looks from the outside, measured in a laboratory, but as it feels from inside, the moment of having a thought. What he found is this: the mind does not stop, not when you want it to, not when you are tired, not when you are lying in the dark at 11 at night willing it to be quiet. The stream continues. But here is what James also found, and this is the part that matters to you tonight. The stream has a temperature. Some thoughts run hot. They grip the attention. They pull at everything nearby. Other thoughts are cooler. They pass through without demanding anything. And there is a third kind, the fringe. The halo of associations around every thought, the sense of meaning and relation that clings to each moment. Most of the stream is fringe. You are floating in it right now. He did not argue that you could stop the stream. He argued that you could understand it. And understanding it, recognizing that the mind's restlessness is not a malfunction, but its nature, changes the experience of lying awake with it. Wundt, in his Leipzig laboratory, was measuring reaction times with stopwatches and bells. James was sitting in a chair in Cambridge, watching the inside of his own mind. Both were working rigorously. What James gave us was something Wundt could not, a description of what the stream feels like when you are the one flowing through it. The body already knew this. Notice, if you want to, how your breath is moving, how it is not a single thing, but a series of small adjustments, each one overlapping the last. The stream works the same way. In the 1860s, James was not yet thinking about any of this. He was thinking about paint. Chapter 3. The Painter and the Limit. In 1860, when he was 18 years old, William James persuaded his father to let him study painting with William Morris Hunt in Newport, Rhode Island. Hunt was one of the most admired teachers of his generation. He had studied in Paris in the studio of Jean-François Millet and brought back to America a seriousness about craft that most American painters lacked. His first instruction to every student was not about technique, it was about looking. Before the brush touched the canvas, you had to learn to see what was actually in front of you, not what you expected to see. James took to this. He worked hard, he drew well. He had a natural facility with line and an unusual ability to convey weight in a sketched figure. But after a year in Newport, he quietly decided that he was not going to be a great painter. He was good. He might have become very good. But the distance between very good and original was large, and he could feel it. Years later, he wrote about what it had felt like to recognize that limit. He said it was not a failure, it was a kind of clarity. The person who gives up the thing they are good at in order to find the thing they were made for is not retreating, they are choosing. And the act of choosing freely, based on an honest reading of one's own capacities, this was, for James, already a philosophical act. He entered the Lawrence Scientific School at Harvard in 1861. He studied chemistry, then comparative anatomy, then medicine. He was looking for a home for his mind. Two kinds of tiredness, remember. We have named the first, and you may already know it. The second is quieter. It lives in the body differently. We will get there. Henry James Sr., the father, the man of the vastation, was ambivalent about his eldest son's constant changes of direction. He expected his children to find something with the same completeness that his own vastation had enforced on him. William resisted the completeness. He needed to move through things in order to understand them. In 1865, a chance arrived that looked like a settling. Louis Agassiz, the great naturalist at Harvard, was organizing an expedition to Brazil to study the fish of the Amazon. He needed young men who could work in difficult conditions. James volunteered. He arrived in Rio de Janeiro in the spring of 1865. He was immediately taken by the scale of things, the river, the canopy, the complete foreignness of the ecology. He wrote long letters home describing what he saw. He was, for the first time in years, genuinely absorbed. Then he got sick. Smallpox, a month of fever, and following it, when the fever broke, a depression he had not expected and could not shake. He wrote to his father that he had begun to doubt whether he was cut out for scientific work. He wrote that he felt hollow. Notice your breath. Let it settle. You do not need to hold it in any particular shape. He came home from Brazil in 1866, a year earlier than planned. He was 24. He resumed his medical studies at Harvard. The depression did not lift. Chapter 4. The Family of Storms. The James family was not, by ordinary standards, an easy family to be born into. Henry James Sr., the father, was a man of enormous vitality and genuine strangeness. He had grown up in Albany, the son of a wealthy Irish immigrant who left his fortune to a large family. Henry Sr. spent the money freely on books and travel and a private theology he spent his life writing, certain that no one would understand it until after his death. The devastation had happened when William was 2. The family was in England. One evening after dinner, sitting by the fire, Henry Sr. felt something enter the room. He described it later, many times in many versions, as a damned shape squatting in the corner. A presence so alien and so malevolent that it reduced him in seconds from a healthy man to something barely able to breathe. The feeling lasted for 2 or 3 seconds. The aftermath lasted 2 years. He eventually found his way through the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedish mystic with his own elaborate theology of inner spiritual states. Henry Sr. decided that what he had experienced was a devastation in the Swedenborgian sense, a stripping away, a descent into emptiness before a new structure could be built. He never fully got over it. And he never stopped talking about it. His children grew up listening, and what they absorbed, all 5 of them, in different ways, was a sense that the self was not stable, that beneath the surface of ordinary life, something could arrive and reorganize everything. Alice James, the youngest daughter, understood this from her own body. She was ill for most of her adult life. In 1891, the year before she died, she dictated a diary to her companion, Catherine Loring. It is one of the most precise accounts of suffering in the English language. She described the experience of being sick in a woman's body in Victorian society as a kind of enforced immobility, the mind racing while the body was told to lie still. A condition, one might note, that many people lying in the dark tonight would recognize. Henry James Jr., the novelist, responded to the family's instability by becoming extremely stable in his prose. He watched everything from a careful distance and rendered it with absolute precision. He needed to be somewhere else from what he was observing in order to see it clearly. William needed to be inside it. The father's devastation, Alice's confined body, Henry's careful distance, William's restlessness. They were 4 responses to the same original fact, that the self is not as solid as it looks. And this is the house that William James grew up in. It explains, at least in part, why he spent his life trying to understand what the self actually was, not as a theological proposition, but as an empirical question. The body already knows this. A person who lies in the dark reviewing the day is not examining external facts. They are examining the self that lived the day, the self that spoke and was spoken to, that chose and was chosen. This review has an urgency that ordinary events do not. The self feels important in a way that the weather does not. James understood this urgency. He had felt it from the inside, in his family's house, where the self was always the subject under discussion. Chapter 5. The Decision at 28. In February of 1870, William James made a decision in his diary. He had been unwell for 3 years. The depression had not lifted after Brazil. It had deepened through the completion of his medical degree, through a period of treatment he sought in Germany, through an attempt to find clarity through wide reading that only deepened the problem. He had developed a particular terror, which he wrote about years later in The Varieties of Religious Experience, publishing it under the guise of a French correspondence account, though the experience was his own. He described visiting a patient in a mental asylum and looking at a man who was entirely catatonic, greenish-skinned, huddled still, and realizing in his body that there was nothing separating himself from that condition except a habit of thought. The inner citadel of the self was less defended than he had imagined. He wrote in his diary that he feared dissolution of the bonds of self, that he would fall into a state of mere will-less vegetation. And then he read Charles Renouvier. Renouvier was a French philosopher, not widely read today, but significant in his time. He had written a careful philosophical argument for the existence of free will, not a religious argument, a logical one. The free will in Renouvier's account was the capacity of the mind to choose to sustain one thought rather than allow another to replace it. The capacity to attend deliberately to one thing when the conditions would allow any number of other things to take its place. James wrote in his diary on the 1st of February 1870 something that amounts to this, that he had finished Renouvier's essay and could see no reason why the definition of free will as the sustaining of a thought, because one chooses to when one might have other thoughts, needed to be an illusion. And that, at any rate, he would assume for the present, until next year, that it was no illusion. His first act of free will would be to believe in free will. That entry, written at 28, in a rented room in Cambridge on a cold February morning, is perhaps the most important thing William James ever did. Not because it solved anything immediately, it did not. The depression continued. But something had changed in the way he stood toward it. He had chosen not to be healthy, not to be happy, only to act as if the choice were real for 1 year and see what the year produced. Hold that gently, it returns. Chapter 6, The Beginning of Teaching. In 1872, 3 years after the diary entry, William James was invited to teach physiology at Harvard. He was 30 years old. He had a medical degree he had not used. He had spent most of his 20s in rooms, reading and suffering. Now he had a classroom. He was, by all accounts, an extraordinary teacher. He did not lecture from notes. He spoke from thinking, which meant his classes moved in unexpected directions, followed ideas down their branches, came back to the trunk only when he had exhausted a branch worth exploring. Students found him alarming and completely absorbing. He was too alive, too unpredictable, too willing to say, "I don't know," and then reason aloud toward a tentative answer for the classroom to feel ordinary. But ordinary was not what his students remembered. What they remembered was being trusted to follow a complicated argument, and finding, to their surprise, that they could. He moved from physiology to psychology in 1875. There was no psychology department at Harvard. He was inventing the field for American purposes, as he went. He established a small demonstration room, some equipment, some basic instruments that has been described as an early psychology laboratory in America. The distinction is debated. Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig, formally established in 1879, has the clearer institutional claim. But James's room was there, and what happened in it was different from Wundt's project in any case. Wundt wanted to measure. James wanted to understand. The distinction was not a small one. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. Let the voice move through without effort. In 1878, James married Alice Howe Gibbons. He was 36. She was 27. She was, by every account, the person who made the rest of his life possible. Patient, clear-minded, steady, the complement to his temperament. She organized what he could not. She waited out the depressions when they returned. She read his manuscripts and told him honestly what was unclear. He signed the contract for The Principles of Psychology in 1878. His publisher expected the manuscript in 2 years. James would take 12. Chapter 7, The Stream and Its Banks. The concept of the stream of consciousness did not arrive fully formed. James had been approaching it for years, since his earliest teaching, since the days in Brazil when he had watched his own mind try to make sense of an entirely foreign environment. He had noticed that the mind could not stop. It could redirect. It could narrow its focus. But the movement itself never paused. He tried several metaphors before settling on the stream. He considered the river. He tried the flight and perch, the way a bird settles briefly on a branch and then lifts again. He returned always to water, because water has the property of being both shaped by its banks and capable of carving new ones. What he wanted to capture was not just the continuity of thought, but its transitions, the hinge points between one idea and the next. These transitions, he argued, were not blank spaces. They were a kind of knowing, a sense of where the thought was going, of its direction and weight and feeling tone, felt before it was articulated. He called this the fringe, the halo of relations clinging to each thought, known in the body before known in the mind. This fringe is why you can feel a thought before you have it. It is why a word on the tip of your tongue is felt as an absence, a negative shape, why you know you are about to remember something 10 seconds before you remember it. The fringe is alive in you right now, between each word. Wilhelm Wundt, reading a summary of James's ideas, reportedly said something dismissive about American psychology. James was not troubled. He had learned, by 1885, that the most useful discoveries about the mind were unlikely to come from a laboratory with a stopwatch. There is a quieter layer beneath that. The stream does not ask for your help. It flows whether you attend to it or not. The banks of the stream, the edges that shape its direction over time, are what James called habit. And habit, he would argue, is the most important thing a psychology of the self can describe. Because the stream of consciousness flows through the grooves that habit has made, change the grooves and you change where the water goes. We will come to habit, but first, the body. Chapter 8, what the body knows first. In 1884, William James published a paper in the philosophy journal Mind. It was titled, "What is an Emotion?" It became the beginning of what is now called the James Lange theory of emotion. Carl Lange, a Danish physiologist, had published independently in Danish a very similar idea at roughly the same time. James and Lange had reached the same conclusion from different starting points without knowledge of each other's work. The theory bears both their names. The idea is this: we do not tremble because we are afraid because we tremble. The body responds first. The hammering heart, the tightened chest, the quickened breath, these happen before the conscious label we place on them. The emotion, as we experience it, the feeling of fear or grief or joy, is the mind's interpretation of what the body is already doing. James put it directly in his paper: take away the bodily symptoms from a state of fear, and what remains? Abstract recognition that a threatening thing exists, not fear. The feeling of fear is the racing heart, the cold hands, the dry mouth. Remove those, and you have removed the fear itself. This was not a comfortable idea. It located the emotions in the body rather than in some higher chamber. It suggested that emotions are, in the most literal sense, felt bodily events that the mind then names. But it also opened something practical. If the body leads and the mind follows, then the body is a point of entry. You can change the emotional state not by arguing yourself out of it, not by positive thinking, but by doing something physical that shifts the body's posture toward what you need. James did not apply this explicitly to sleep, but he understood that the state of rest was not a mental achievement, it was a bodily one. The mind does not command the body to rest. The body finds its way there when the conditions are right, when the signals from the environment and from the body itself converge into the particular state we call going to sleep. Let your jaw soften. Notice your hands. You do not need to change anything, just notice. The body is already moving in the direction the mind is about to follow. That is how the sequence has always worked. Chapter 9. The Will as a Muscle. If you have heard one thing attributed to William James, it is probably something about habit. The exact phrasing varies. Most versions are paraphrased or tangled by a century of repetition. But the idea at the center is real, and it is his. Habit, James argued in the Principles of Psychology, is not a character trait, it is a neurological groove. Every time you perform an action, you make it slightly easier to perform it again. The nervous system changes with experience. What begins as a deliberate act becomes, through repetition, nearly automatic. The pianist's fingers know the piece, the typist's hands know the keyboard. The anxious mind knows its own loops. This was not a comforting observation, and James did not try to make it comforting. The same process that builds useful habits builds destructive ones. The grooves deepen, the paths widen. Eventually, you are not choosing to take the path, you are simply moving, because that is where the track goes. He wrote, in paraphrase, in the spirit of the habit chapter, that the importance of keeping alive the faculty of effort and interest could not be overstated. That a person who allowed their habits to harden in the wrong shape, not through malice, but through inattention, would spend decades trying to act against patterns laid down in their 20s. But here is the part of the habit chapter that is less often remembered. James believed that forming a new habit required 3 things. You had to begin now, today, not on Monday, because the decision to begin later was itself a habit of deferral that would compound. You had to act on the new resolve before the warmth of the intention faded. And you had to protect the early repetitions by not allowing exceptions. He understood what the habit of a restless mind was, a groove worn into the hours between waking and sleeping, where the same thoughts ran along the same tracks, wearing them deeper. If your mind has been wandering, come back gently. We are still here. William James is still in his study, and the stream is still moving. Chapter 10, The 12-Year Book. In 1890, William James delivered the manuscript of The Principles of Psychology to his publisher, Henry Holt. He had promised it in 2 years. It had taken 12. When it arrived, it ran to nearly 1,400 pages in 2 volumes. James described the book to his publisher with something between apology and relief, a loathsome, bloated mass, he called it. It became one of the most widely read psychology texts of the following century. What James had built over those 12 years was a complete account of the mind as a natural phenomenon. He covered sensation and perception, the stream of consciousness, habit, attention, memory, imagination, reasoning, instinct, will and emotion. He drew on German laboratory science and French clinical psychology and British associationist philosophy. And he translated all of it in prose, unusually vivid for a scientific text, into something a curious reader could follow without a laboratory. The chapter on habit was the one people read most often. The chapter on the stream of consciousness was the one that lasted longest in intellectual history. The chapter on the will was the most personal. He wrote the chapter on will during one of the periodic returns of his depression. He wrote it, he told his wife Alice, as a prescription for himself, as if by describing what the act of will actually consisted of, he could make it more available to himself when he most needed it. The will, in James's account, is not force. It is not the heroic clenching of the jaw that the Victorian imagination favoured. The will is the act of returning attention, specifically the act of redirecting a wandering mind back to the object it has been assigned. Nothing more dramatic than that. Just the return. He wrote in Talks to Teachers on Psychology, in a passage widely paraphrased since, that the capacity to bring back a wandering attention over and over again, quietly and without frustration, is the very root of character, judgment, and will. That education, in the deepest sense, is little more than the training of this capacity. An intelligent person lying in bed at 11 at night is not a weak person whose mind has broken. They are a person whose trained faculty of attention has no clear object, and so It moves, as attention always does, toward the things that feel most urgent. Tonight, we are offering it something else. Chapter 11, The Self in 3 Rooms. James proposed, in The Principles of Psychology, that what we call the self is not one thing. It has 3 dimensions. He called them the material self, the social self, and the spiritual self. The material self is the body and everything that feels like an extension of the body: the clothes, the home, the family members, the objects that carry some of the self's weight. A person who loses their house loses not just a structure, but a portion of their material self. This is why it can feel like a death, not merely an inconvenience. The social self is the recognition the person receives from others. James wrote that a person has as many social selves as there are people who recognize them. The self you are with your oldest friend is different from the self you are with a new colleague. Neither is false. They are different facets of the same object, differently lit. What happens when none of those people are present, when the lights of recognition are off and you are alone in a dark room, is that the social self is briefly unmoored. This is not comfortable. It is also, James believed, unusually honest. The spiritual self is the most intimate. It is the sense of self as subject, the inner stream of thoughts and feelings, the sense of being the one who is having the experience rather than the one being observed having it. James was careful about this one. He was not willing to claim that the spiritual self was a soul in the theological sense. He was not willing to claim it was nothing either. He held it as an open question, empirically, and watched it. What happens to all 3 selves when a person lies in the dark? The material self is still. The body is horizontal. The possessions, the home, they are present but not pressing. And yet the social self never really leaves. It rehearses, it replays, it drafts responses to conversations that have not yet happened, and revises responses to conversations that have already finished. This is what the mind does at 11 at night, without a clear object to attend to. It reviews the social fabric. James would have called this the social self, continuing its work after hours. He might have added that the reviews and rehearsals at this hour are less accurate than the ones done in daylight, that exhaustion distorts the weight of things, making small slights feel significant, and ordinary silences feel ominous. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. The body is allowed to be heavy. Chapter 12. Attention, the rarest gift. Of all the things James wrote, the chapter on attention in the Principles of Psychology has the most direct application to the experience of lying in the dark. Attention, he wrote, is the taking possession by the mind, in clear and vivid form, of one out of what seem to be several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. To attend to one thing is necessarily to not attend to another. In a busy day, the selection happens largely by force. The environment provides urgent objects, and the mind moves toward them. A phone, a question, a face, They arrive and pull attention without the person having to choose. The day is, in this sense, easy on the faculty of voluntary attention. It does not ask attention to find its own direction. It provides direction. But the hour before sleep is different. The urgent objects have receded. The phone is face down. The family is quiet. The room is dark. And attention, which has been pulled all day, now has nothing pulling it. So it begins to pull itself. It finds the things that feel unresolved, the conversation that went wrong, the decision that has not been made, the worry that has not found an answer. These are not the most important things in the person's life. They are the most attention-attracting things at this hour. A solved problem is invisible. An unsolved problem glows. James proposed that the discipline of voluntary attention, the capacity to redirect a wandering mind back to a chosen object repeatedly without frustration, was the most valuable thing a person could cultivate. He was thinking of intellectual attention, the kind that sustains work. But the same discipline applies in the opposite direction, not toward a task, but away from urgency. Not toward resolution, but toward the simple fact of the body at rest. Henri Bergson, James's contemporary and close friend, the French philosopher who wrote about time and consciousness, described a similar problem in different terms. Bergson argued that the ordinary waking mind is an instrument built for action, not for rest. It divides, selects, analyzes, prepares. Rest requires a different mode, one that the habitual mind does not access easily. James and Bergson corresponded for decades. They disagreed on details and agreed on the thing underneath, that the mind at rest is not the same as the mind at work, and the transition between them is the place where most of the suffering lives. There is a question beneath the question of why you cannot sleep. We have planted it. It will resurface. Chapter 13. The Sister in the Dark. In 1891, Alice James was dying. She was 42 years old. She had been ill for most of her adult life, confined to rooms, to beds, to the limited radius that Victorian society and her own nervous system allowed her. She had not published anything. She had not travelled alone. She had, by the standards of the world, accomplished nothing. She knew this. She also knew something the world did not, that the interior life she had been conducting in those rooms was as complex, as disciplined, as any accomplished life she had observed in others. She began to dictate her diary in 1889 to her companion Catherine Loring. Alice described her symptoms with the precision of a scientist: the paralysis of will, the panic, the periods of flat non-existence she called going under. She described the effort of being upright, the effort of conversation, the effort of performing the minimum that Victorian society required. And she described what happened in the hours of the night when no performance was required, when the body could stop managing itself and simply be what it was. She did not find those hours peaceful. The mind, in her experience, did not become quieter when the body stopped. It became louder. Every regret, every frustration, every constraint that daylight activity had kept at a manageable distance, these gathered in the dark. And yet, she wrote repeatedly about something she found in the worst of those hours. She called it the something within, a phrase she did not define but trusted enough to use many times, as if pointing at something just beyond the reach of language, a ground beneath the distress, not silence, not peace, but a quality of endurance that was not the same as strength, something that held even when strength was gone. William James read her diary after her death in 1892. He wrote to Henry that their sister had understood more than either of them had written about the experience of being healthy. The room does not answer. Breathe. What Alice found in those long nights, the something within, is not a mystical claim. It is an empirical one. There is a layer of the self that is not the reviewing, not the rehearsing, not the performing. It watches all of that from somewhere quieter. She had more time to find it than most people do. She found it anyway. Chapter 14. The Varieties of What We Know. James was, throughout the 1890s, moving toward a question he had been circling his whole life. He had studied the body. He had studied the mind. He had written the most comprehensive account of mental life yet produced in the English language. And he was not satisfied. Because there was a region of experience he had not yet addressed directly, the region his father had entered in the vastation, the region that Alice had touched in her worst hours, the region James himself had known in that cold room in 1869. He called it, cautiously, the mystical, not in the sense of the inexplicable, but in the sense of the limit experience, the moment when ordinary consciousness is suspended and something else seems to operate. He was careful to study it empirically. He was not willing to say such experiences were mere hallucination, because he had had one himself. He was not willing to say they were windows into a literal supernatural realm, because his training would not allow that claim. He chose a third position, that these experiences, whatever their ultimate nature, were real psychological events with real effects on the people who had them. The Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, which he delivered in 1901 and 1902, became the Varieties of religious experience. It remains one of the most careful and compassionate accounts of what it is like to be transformed by an experience you did not expect and cannot fully explain. He organized the book around a distinction he called the once-born and the twice-born. The once-born person lives on the sunlit surface of things. Life feels fundamentally workable. Problems are real but manageable. The once-born person does not feel a fundamental darkness in the nature of existence, only particular difficulties in particular situations. The twice-born person has fallen through the surface. Something has shown them the darkness underneath, the contingency of everything, the certainty of loss, the possibility that nothing is guaranteed. And they have come back. They have rebuilt themselves from a deeper foundation than the once-born person has ever needed to find. The twice-born are not superior. They have suffered more. But what they have built is harder to destroy. Something shifts here. Let the weight of the pillow settle. Chapter 15, The Anonymous Voice. Hidden in the chapter on the sick soul in the Varieties of Religious Experience, there is a first-person account of a panic attack. James attributes it to a French correspondent whose account he is translating. For most of the 20th century, scholars took this at face value. Then they read his diary. The account is James's own. He describes a moment which aligns precisely with everything we know of his crisis of 1869, in which he went into his dressing room one evening and saw in his mind's eye a patient he had once seen in an asylum, entirely catatonic, entirely vacant, greenish-skinned, huddled against the wall. And in the moment of seeing that image, he understood in his body that there was nothing separating himself from that condition except a habit of thought. The image filled him with a fear so total that it drove him from the room. He described wrapping himself in a private faith that carried him through the months that followed, not theology exactly, but a deliberate choice to act as if the self were real and worth defending. He wrote of the experience afterward, that it had made him sympathetic with the morbid feelings of others ever since. Why did he publish it anonymously? Because in 1902, a Harvard professor who disclosed his own history of breakdown was not safe in his position in the way he might be today. Because the Victorian conception of the scholarly mind and the Victorian conception of the broken mind were, in public understanding, mutually exclusive. But he published it. He put it in the book in plain sight, so that anyone who recognized themselves in it would know you are not alone. The man who wrote The Theory of Habit and The Stream of Consciousness and The Discipline of Attention, he sat in his dressing room in 1869 and was undone by a thought, and he found a way back. If your mind has wandered, come back gently. We are still here. There is a question running beneath this night. We have named two kinds of tiredness. One is the body. The other is something older. We are closer now. Chapter 16, The Will to Believe. James published The Will to Believe in 1897. The title essay has often been misread as a license for wishful thinking. It is not that. The question James was addressing, when evidence is genuinely insufficient to decide a question, not when you are being lazy, not when you are avoiding inquiry, but when you have genuinely inquired and the evidence runs out before the answer does, do you have the right to believe? His answer was yes. Under specific conditions. The option must be genuine. Both possibilities must be real. The option must be forced. You cannot abstain, because even abstaining counts as a choice with consequences. And the option must be momentous. The stakes are large enough that the decision shapes how you live. Under those conditions, James argued, the will can rightfully tip the balance toward belief. Not because the belief is proven, because the cost of withholding belief while waiting for a certainty that will never come is too high. He was thinking about faith. He was also thinking about himself. The decision he had made in 1870 to believe in free will as an act of free will itself was a perfect example of the argument he was now making. The evidence for free will philosophically is not conclusive. The evidence against it is not conclusive either. The option is genuine, it is forced, and it is momentous. How you answer it shapes whether you act at all. James had chosen to act, and the choice, year by year, had rebuilt him. The person lying awake at midnight often faces a smaller version of this. Not the grand philosophical question, but the question of whether to trust that the day was enough. Whether to trust that the unsolved things can wait for morning, whether to trust the body's wisdom that the current moment asks for rest, not resolution. The evidence is never conclusive, but the will can still tip the balance. Chapter 17, The Brother at the Desk. Henry James Jr., the novelist, worked differently from his brother. He sat at his desk for 6 or 7 hours a day. He wrote slowly, revising every sentence, sometimes every phrase. He produced between 1,870 and 1,910 20 novels, more than 100 short stories, plays, criticism, travel writing, and autobiography. He organized his life entirely around the writing. William found this approach baffling and slightly admirable. He could not sustain that kind of focused production. His own work was more erratic. Periods of intense writing interrupted by teaching, correspondence, travel, depression. He wrote The Principles of Psychology not in 6-hour sessions, but in fragments accumulated over 12 years. The two brothers were in correspondence their whole adult lives. The letters between them are extraordinary, warm, argumentative, mutually respectful, always slightly competitive. Henry once wrote to William that William wrote philosophy as if it were literature, and he wrote literature as if it were philosophy. William thought this was a compliment. He was not entirely sure Henry meant it as one. Henry understood something about consciousness that William was trying to prove scientifically, that the mind is always moving, always revising, always slightly ahead of its own articulation. He had tried to capture this in his late novels, the sentences that coil around a thought and approach it from 4 directions before naming it. He had learned some of this, he said, from reading William's chapter on the stream. The family had been swimming in the same stream for decades. They just described it differently. Nothing you hear tonight asks anything of you. The current runs beneath the words. There is something worth holding from the brothers, that the same experience of consciousness can produce radically different lives, and that both lives can be worth living. Henry's patience and William's restlessness were not better and worse versions of the same mind. They were the same mind's 2 honest answers to the question of what to do with itself. Chapter 18, Pragmatism. What works is real. In 1907, James published Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking. He was 65. His health was declining. He gave 8 lectures at the Lowell Institute in Boston and at Columbia University with what observers described as unusual urgency. He knew time was shortening. Pragmatism was not a new philosophy. His friend Charles Sanders Peirce had coined the word. John Dewey, the education philosopher who had taken James's ideas and extended them into pedagogy, had been developing his own version independently. But James was the one who made it comprehensible to a general audience. The central claim: ideas are instruments, not portraits. An idea is not true because it corresponds accurately to some fixed reality out there. An idea is true insofar as it works, insofar as it leads to satisfying consequences, to experiences that confirm it, to a world you can navigate successfully with it. This was controversial. Critics accused James of saying that anything you want to believe is true, as long as you believe it hard enough. He spent considerable energy explaining why this was wrong. What he meant was this: truth is not given once and for all. It is made through experience over time. A map is not true or false in the abstract. It is useful or not useful for getting from this place to that place. An idea functions the same way. Does it help you navigate? Does it open possibilities that were closed before? For the person lying awake at midnight, James's pragmatism has a particular application. The question is not, is this thought true? Because most thoughts at midnight are not truth claims in any serious sense. They are habits, rehearsals, loops. The useful question is this thought helping me get to where I need to be tonight? And if not, if the thought is running on a groove worn by repetition rather than by necessity, then attending to something else is not avoiding reality. It is the more accurate response to what this moment actually requires. Chapter 19: The Second Wind. James wrote about fatigue in several places, and what he said has not entirely entered the popular understanding of the subject. He distinguished between what he called the first layer of fatigue and the reserves that lie beneath it. The first layer of fatigue is what most people treat as the end point, the heaviness in the limbs, the reluctance of the mind to take on new material, the sense that the day is full and nothing more can be added. This is where most people stop. But James argued, based on his own experience and his observations of athletes, soldiers, and people in crisis, that the first layer of fatigue is not the bottom. Beneath it, there is a second wind. A second layer of capacity, physiologically real, that becomes available when the first layer is exhausted, and beneath that, sometimes, a third. He had experienced this himself in the periods of intense writing, when he had worked past the point of comfortable productivity and found, to his surprise, that the mind continued, not easily. Not without cost, but it continued. He did not present this as an argument for overwork. He was careful about that. He was presenting it as evidence that the experience of limit is not always the actual limit. The application for the person lying awake is almost the reverse. The question is not, can I push past my limit? The question is, what is on the other side of the first layer of wakefulness? Wakefulness, too, has its layers. The vigilant mind that insists on attending to unresolved things is the first layer. Beneath it, there is a quieter layer, less insistent, more diffuse, less certain of its own urgency. And beneath that, something that is not quite thought. We are approaching the two kinds of tiredness. The first kind you know. The second is quieter and older. Hold it, we will name it in full before the night is done. Chapter 20, The Varieties of Experience at Night. In The Varieties of Religious Experience, James described what he called the noetic quality of certain unusual states of consciousness. By this he meant that they carried the feeling of knowledge, the sense afterward that something had been learned or seen that was not accessible in ordinary waking life. Dreams have this quality sometimes. The borderland between waking and sleeping has it. What James called the hypnagogic state, where the mind is still conscious but has loosened its control over the direction of thought, he found deeply interesting. He had experienced it himself. He had even taken nitrous oxide on 2 occasions in an experimental context and found that it produced a state in which ordinary distinctions dissolved. He wrote about the nitrous oxide experience with the empiricism he brought to everything. He did not claim to have discovered anything supernatural. He claimed to have observed in himself a state in which the sense of contradiction, the sense that this cannot coexist with that, temporarily suspended itself. He found this philosophically interesting rather than mystically transforming, but he noted, and this is relevant to the borderland of sleep, that the state of loosened control of consciousness without full direction was not empty. It was, in its way, full of a different kind of knowing. Epictetus, the Stoic teacher, who had been born enslaved and who ran a school in Nicopolis after his freedom, he described something related in different terms. He wrote that the mind in its waking vigilance was always filtering experience through the screen of opinion and judgment. Remove the judgment, the evaluation of whether what is happening is good or bad, threatening or safe, and what remains is experience as it actually is. Both James and Epictetus arrived at the same practical instruction: watch rather than evaluate, notice rather than judge. The experience of the borderland before sleep is one in which this becomes temporarily possible. Chapter 21. What fear is actually made of. In his paper on emotion, and again in The Principles of Psychology, James made an observation about fear that has not been fully absorbed. The body does not distinguish physiologically between fear and excitement. The racing heart, the tightened chest, the quickened breath, these are present in both states. What distinguishes them is the narrative the mind places over the physical event. Fear is excitement with a threatening story. Excitement is fear with an inviting one. James did not draw the obvious self-help conclusion, so just tell yourself a better story. He knew it was not that simple. The body's response precedes the narrative. By the time you can consciously examine the loop, it has been running for several seconds and has already shaped what you think is available to do. What he did argue is that the body is a point of leverage, not the narrative that comes too late, the body itself. Slow the breath, and the racing heart has less fuel. Soften the hands and shoulders, and the signal of threat is partially interrupted. The fear that runs in the mind at night, the review of what could go wrong, the replay of what already has, lives in the body first. It is a bodily state that the mind has found language for. To change what the mind is doing, it sometimes helps to change what the body is doing first. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight of the pillow. The body does not need permission to be heavy. It has been waiting for this all day. There is a third kind of restlessness that is not exactly fear and not exactly urgency. It is the mind's search pattern running on nothing, producing the sensation of something unfinished without the content of what that something is. James called this the unrest of self-consciousness. We will return to it. Hold it there. Chapter 22. The sick soul and its gift. The sick soul, as James described it in the Varieties of religious experience, is not simply the depressed person. It is the person who has been given an education in reality that the healthy-minded person has not received. The healthy-minded person lives by a disposition toward optimism that is not achieved through effort but simply present, temperamentally. Things look possible. Problems look manageable. Death is an abstraction. The healthy-minded person does not feel a fundamental darkness in the nature of existence, only particular difficulties in particular situations. The sick soul cannot maintain this. The contingency of things has become visible. The certainty of loss is not an idea but a felt reality. The ordinary cheerfulness that works for the once-born person is not available. It has been seen through. But what the sick soul arrives at, if it does not destroy itself in the process, is something different from simple recovery. It arrives at a deeper affirmation, one that has gone through the darkness and found something on the other side. Not the cheerfulness of someone who has never been seriously tested, the equanimity of someone who has been tested and remained. James called this conversion, in the psychological sense, not the adoption of new beliefs, but the reorganization of the self around a new center, one that can hold darkness without being extinguished by it. His father's vastation was a conversion of this kind. His own crisis of 1869 was another version. Alice's illness, in its terrible extended form, was yet another. The person lying awake at night with a mind full of unsolvable things is not necessarily undergoing a conversion. But the quality of the experience, the sense that the self's ordinary moorings have loosened, that the things that usually organize the day have receded, and something unguarded remains, is related to what James was describing. In that state, there is a quality of openness, unwanted, unasked for, but real. The defenses are down. The performances are over. Something is there that is usually behind the performance. James believed this was where the real work happened, not the work of fixing, the work of seeing. Chapter 23. Emerson and the Inheritance. James had met Ralph Waldo Emerson when he was a child. Emerson was a family friend. He had visited the house on Quincy Street several times during William's boyhood. James remembered a tall, quiet man who said little and left the room slightly rearranged by having been in it. Emerson died in 1882 when James was 40. By then, James had formed his own philosophy, and the debts to Emerson were both clear and contested. Emerson's doctrine of self-reliance, the argument that every person contains within themselves a sufficient guide to their own life, and that the first obligation of the self is to trust that inner guide rather than inherited opinion, was in some ways the seed of pragmatism. The idea that the individual's experience is the test of truth, not the authority of tradition, is Emersonian before it is pragmatist. But James modified it. Emerson's self-reliance sometimes suggested that if you trusted the self fully, everything would work out. James was more cautious. He had lived through the period when trusting the self meant trusting a self in freefall. He knew that the inner guide could also be the voice of the panic, the voice of the wound, the voice of the groove worn deep by repetition. What he took from Emerson was the faith that the self, even in distress, has a depth worth trusting. That beneath the layer of anxious revision and social performance, there is something quieter and more accurate. Not infallible, not mystical, but real. This is not so different from what his sister Alice had found in her diary. The real self is not the one performing. It is the one watching the performance with a slightly cooler detachment, wondering what all the urgency is about. The one who watches is always calmer than the one being watched. Emerson knew this. James knew it. Alice found it on her own in those long, still nights, because she had no other choice. Chapter 24. The Gifford Lectures. In 1901, William James travelled to Edinburgh to deliver the Gifford Lectures on natural religion. He was 59. His heart was already showing signs of the condition that would kill him 9 years later. He had declined the invitation once and then accepted. The crossing from New York to Liverpool took 2 weeks. Edinburgh in October is cold and grey. James found the greyness congenial. He had never much liked the American summer with its aggressive optimism. He preferred climates that asked less of the mood. The lecture hall at the University of Edinburgh was full every time he spoke. He was already famous, not just in academic circles, but among the general public that read his essays on will and habit. The audience included ministers and physicians and lawyers and simply curious people who had heard there was a Harvard professor speaking about religion without insisting on theology. What he offered them was a method. He would treat religious experience, the sudden conversion, the mystical state, the prayer that seemed to be answered, the despair that lifted without apparent cause, as psychological events worthy of careful observation. He was explicit. He was not going to prove or disprove the existence of God. He was going to describe what happened to people who had experiences they called religious. He was going to take their testimony seriously, and he was going to ask what these experiences functionally did. What changed in the person afterward? The results, published as The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, remain the most widely read of his works. Not because they answered the question of God, they did not, but because they treated with complete seriousness the experience of being human in the dark, in the hour before the place of arrival that cannot be fully named. If your mind has been drifting, come back gently. We are still here. The night is moving forward. Chapter 25. The Philosophy of the Present Moment. Toward the end of his career, James became increasingly interested in what he called radical empiricism, the philosophy of pure experience. The idea was this: the fundamental stuff of existence is not mind and it is not matter. It is experience, raw, undivided experience, which the mind then organizes into objects and relations. The division between subject and object, between the one who is experiencing and the thing being experienced, is something the mind adds. The experience itself does not come pre-divided. This put him close to Henri Bergson, his friend and correspondent, who was arguing at the same time that the ordinary concepts of the intellect, including the concept of the present moment as a dimensionless point between past and future, were inadequate to describe what time actually felt, like from the inside. Bergson called the lived experience of time duration. The present moment as actually felt is not a mathematical instant. It is thick with the just past and the about to be. It is more like a wave, always in the process of breaking, never quite finished arriving. James loved this. He wrote to Bergson that this was the right name for what he had been trying to describe in his chapter on the stream of consciousness: the experience of time from inside it, rather than the map of time seen from a position outside and above. The practical consequence, and James always asked for the practical consequence, the cash value of an idea is this: the present moment, as it is actually felt, is not as thin as it seems. It contains the residue of what just happened and the lean toward what is coming. And in the lean toward sleep, it contains the slight loosening of the grip that waking consciousness maintains on the direction of experience. This loosening is not a loss. It is a transition. And you are in it right now. Chapter 26. The Meeting in Worcester. In September of 1909, at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, William James met Sigmund Freud. It was the first and only time they met. Freud had been invited to lecture at Clark's anniversary celebration. He came from Vienna with Carl Jung and Sandor Ferenczi. James made the trip from Cambridge to Worcester on a warm September day, knowing his heart was not well. He sat through Freud's lectures. He said little directly to Freud, but afterward he told a colleague that he had found Freud's work pointing in the right direction, that the investigation of the region of consciousness the person cannot directly access was going to matter greatly, whatever its final form. James had been skeptical of psychoanalysis for the same reasons he was skeptical of most system building. He distrusted theories that explained too much, that turned every symptom into evidence for the same underlying cause. He had spent his life resisting the impulse to reduce the complexity of experience to a single mechanism, but he recognized in Freud's project something he had been circling himself since the Varieties of religious experience. The idea that the part of the self we cannot access directly is not merely the absence of consciousness, It is an active region with its own logic and its own influence on what we do and say in the daylight hours. Carl Jung had spent years corresponding with James before that Worcester meeting. He had read The Varieties of Religious Experience, carefully, and drawn from it the concept of the divided self, the twice-born, the sick soul. He would go on in his own work to build an entire psychology of the regions James had been careful to observe without theorizing too heavily. James died the following August, 1910. Freud lived until 1939, Jung until 1961. The conversation they had all entered in Worcester that September morning is still running. Chapter 27, The Second Kind of Tiredness, Closer Now. We planted something near the beginning of this night. Two kinds of tiredness. The first is the body. You know this one by feel. The heaviness of the limbs at the end of a long day. The weight behind the eyes, the reluctance of the muscles to hold any more tension. The body asking for horizontal, for dark, for still. This tiredness is honest, and it asks for one thing, but there is a second kind. James described it in his chapter on the self, without calling it by this name. He described the exhaustion of the social performance, the ongoing work of presenting the right version of the self to the right people in the right contexts. This is not dishonesty. It is the ordinary tax of being a person among other people. By the time the day is over, you have been performing, not falsely, but performing. The version of you at work is not the same as the version of you in the dark. The version of you answering the same question for the third time today was managing something. The version of you that listened when listening was not easy. That version was working. This performance does not announce its fatigue the way physical labor does. It lives in a particular quality of restlessness at night, the sense that even in stillness, something is still running through the script of tomorrow. Something is preparing the next performance before this one has ended. The body is allowed to stop. The self has not been given permission. This is the second kind of tiredness. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a weight to be set down. James understood this weight. He had carried it for decades. He found his own way to set it down, not through formal practice, but through the discipline of attention, by noticing in the moments of quiet that the performance was optional, that the one watching was quieter than the one performing, and that the watcher was in some sense more real. We are nearly to the payoff. Hold it. Chapter 28, Habit as Shelter. James's most practical gift to the person lying awake is not the stream of consciousness, not pragmatism, not the will to believe. It is a smaller observation buried in the chapter on habit. He wrote that habit, in its fullness, performs a great service to the organism. It removes the need for constant decision. Once a behavior is sufficiently habituated, it no longer draws on the reservoir of will, it flows automatically. The effort that once went into choosing is freed for other purposes. This is true of the bad habits. They run without being chosen, which is why they are hard to interrupt. But it is equally true of the good ones. The person who has habituated a walk at the same hour each day does not have to decide whether to take it. The person who has habituated a period of quiet before sleep does not negotiate with themselves about whether tonight deserves it. The behavior runs on its own track because the track has been worn by repetition. James was describing something that neuroscientists would confirm a century later, that well-worn paths in the nervous system are genuinely easier to travel. The groove is not just a metaphor. It is a description of actual changes in the structure of neural tissue. For the restless mind, this means that the path to a quieter night is not a heroic act of will performed fresh each evening. It is the accumulation of small consistencies, the same hour, the same quality of darkness and quiet, the same signal that this is not the time for resolution, but for descent. Over many nights, these signals train the nervous system to recognize the cue and begin the transition without being asked. This is not a solution for tonight, but it is a description of what tonight can be the beginning of. Each night that moves in this direction is one more pass of the groove maker. The groove deepens. The next night finds the path slightly more worn. Let your jaw soften. There is no decision to be made here. The track is already laid. Chapter 29. The Divided Self and its Reuniting. James's concept of the divided self, drawn from his observations in the Varieties of religious experience, is directly relevant to the experience of being awake when you want to be asleep. The divided self is the self in which two tendencies pull against each other. One wants rest, one is convinced that something remains unfinished, one wants to let the day go. One is reviewing it for errors, preparing corrections, rehearsing what it will say tomorrow. James described the resolution of a divided self, what he called conversion in the psychological sense, as always involving a surrender. Not a capitulation to defeat, but a release of the tension of trying to hold both sides simultaneously. At some point, one side wins. Not through force, but through the exhaustion of the resistance. In the cases James observed, this often happened at the precise moment when the struggling person stopped struggling, when the effort of holding the self together against its own divisions was finally let go, and something else moved in. He was careful not to prescribe this. He described it. He observed that it seemed to happen more readily at certain physical conditions. In quiet, in low light, in states of low arousal, in conditions very much like the ones you are in right now. The divided self cannot command itself to be unified, but it can stop trying to win the argument. It can notice that both sides, the wanting to rest and the insisting on review, are exhausted. And in the exhaustion of the argument, something between them sometimes opens. The unrest we named earlier, the mind's search pattern running on nothing, producing urgency without content, is the divided self at full tension. What resolves it is not more thinking. What resolves it is the same thing that resolved James's crisis in 1870. a choice, not to fix everything, just to attend to this moment, this breath, this weight, and to make that choice again, quietly, when the next thought arrives. Chapter 30. Letters to those who suffered. William James received, throughout his career, an unusual volume of correspondence from strangers. People wrote to him after reading The Will to Believe to say that the essay had kept them from making a final decision. People wrote after The Varieties of Religious Experience to say they had recognized themselves in the sick soul, and the recognition had made them feel less alone in the worst hours. People wrote after reading his chapters on habit to say they had made one change consistently for 90 days and found their life had reorganized around it. He wrote back, not to all of them, but to a significant number. The letters are archived at Harvard's Houghton Library. They are kind without being sentimental. They treat the person writing as someone capable of being helped by a real idea, not by reassurance alone. To those who felt their lives were not working and could not explain why, he offered something like this, in paraphrase. In the spirit of his documented approach, begin with the smallest possible change. Not the change you think you should make, the change that is actually available to you today in the conditions you actually have. And when you have made that change for long enough that it no longer requires decision, look for the next one. He did not tell anyone what the change should be. He trusted them to know. This is worth holding. Not because James was a therapist, he was not, but because the instruction reveals the shape of his philosophy in its practical form. The large things change slowly, through the accumulation of small ones. The self is not transformed by a single decision, it is rebuilt by a series of returns. If you are still awake, this is the part I wanted you to hear. The return is the practice, not the arrival. The return. Chapter 31. The attention at night. We have come to the payoff of the second loop. Earlier in this night we asked, why do thoughts not stop at night? And we noted that the answer would come. Here it is. Thoughts do not stop at night because attention has nowhere to go. The body is quiet. The environment is neutral. The urgent objects of the day have withdrawn. And attention, which James described as always moving toward the most vivid, the most urgent, the most charged object in the field, cannot find an object outside, so it reaches inward. What it finds there is the unresolved. Not because the unresolved is the most important thing in your life, but because it is the most attention-attracting thing at this hour. A finished thing is invisible. An unfinished thing glows. James understood this and drew a practical conclusion. He did not conclude that you should resolve everything before sleeping. He concluded that you should give attention a different object, not suppress the thoughts, not fight them. Redirect the attention quietly, without drama, toward something with a lower charge, the weight of the body, the movement of the breath, the words in a quiet narration passing through, the sense of the room around you. Voluntary attention, the sustained, quiet, patient act of returning the mind to a chosen object, was for James the deepest exercise of the will. And the will, exercised, builds the capacity for its own further exercise. You are doing it right now. The thoughts will return. They always do. Their return is not a failure. It is simply the nature of the stream. The noticing of the return and the quiet act of redirecting is the whole practice. James never put it in those terms, but he practiced it his whole life, first against the depression, then against the distraction of a crowded professional life, then against the failing body of his final years. The practice does not change with the object it is resisting. It is always the same: return, return, return. Chapter 32. The first kind of tiredness and the second. We come now to the payoff of the first loop. Two kinds of tiredness. The first is the body. You know it by now. It is honest and it asks for one thing: horizontal, dark, still. The body that has done the work of the day is not complicated. It wants what it wants, and it will eventually get there. The second kind is older and quieter. No amount of sleep resolves it immediately. It is the tiredness of the self that has been performing, managing, reviewing, preparing, comparing, and never quite resting between any of these. It is the tiredness that makes a person wake after 8 hours still feeling heavy. It is the tiredness that lies behind the restlessness, not the restlessness itself. James did not name it in these terms, but his psychology points precisely here. The second kind of tiredness is not asking for sleep. It is asking for permission. Permission to stop performing, even for the length of a night. Permission to let the unsolved problems remain unsolved until morning without the mind's urgent presence being required for their custody. Permission, in the most fundamental sense, to not be responsible for everything in the hours when nothing can be done. This permission cannot be given by someone else. It cannot be earned through exhaustion. It can only be chosen quietly, without ceremony, the same way James chose to believe in free will on a February morning in 1870. He had no guarantee it would work. He chose anyway, and the choice, sustained over days and then years, rebuilt the self that had come apart in that cold Cambridge room. You are making your own version of that choice tonight, not the grand version, the small one, the one made in the dark with no guarantee, simply because the alternative, the loop, the review, the held tension, is not what you need. The room does not answer. Breathe. Chapter 33, The Nervous System at Rest. James spent considerable time in The Principles of Psychology on the physiology of habit and the nervous system. What he wrote, without the vocabulary of modern neuroscience, has largely been confirmed. The nervous system, he argued, was plastic, not fixed at birth, not completed at adolescence, plastic throughout life, capable of being reshaped by experience, by repetition, by deliberate practice. Every time you do something, the tissue changes slightly. The path becomes slightly easier to travel. He was wrong about some of the mechanisms. He did not have the vocabulary of synapses or neuroplasticity or long-term potentiation. But the underlying claim has held. The brain changes in response to what it does. This applies to the state of rest as much as the state of work. A nervous system that has learned over years to remain at high vigilance through the night, to continue running pattern detection and problem solving through the dark hours, does not turn off simply because the person decides it should. The groove is worn, the track runs, the train moves. But the plastic nervous system can also learn a different groove, slowly, with repetition, with the consistency that James described as essential to habit formation. The same hour, the same quality of darkness and quiet, the same signal that this is not the time for resolution, but for descent. The period before sleep is, in this view, not a problem to be managed, but a capacity to be built. Each night that ends with the body arriving at rest, having moved through the transitions without force, is one more pass of the groove maker. The practice deepens the groove. The next night finds the path slightly more worn. James believed the body was a learner. It learns rest the same way it learns everything else, through repetition, through consistency, through the accumulated weight of many nights moving in the same direction. Tonight is one of those nights. Chapter 34. The Last Classes. James retired from Harvard in 1907. He was 65. He had been on the faculty for 35 years, first as a lecturer in anatomy, then physiology, then psychology, then philosophy. He had taught thousands of students. He did not leave quietly. In the spring of 1907, he gave the final series of lectures that became Pragmatism. The lecture hall was full each time. He spoke without notes, as he had always done, and the effect was of a man thinking in real time rather than reciting prepared material. Students took notes as fast as they could. Some stayed after to argue with him. James loved the arguments. After retirement, he continued to write. A Pluralistic Universe in 1908, the Gifford Lectures at Oxford, The Meaning of Truth in 1909. He had begun work on a systematic philosophy he was calling Some Problems of Philosophy, an attempt to lay out the full architecture of his thinking in a more rigorous form than the essays and lectures had allowed. He never finished it. He was too ill. In the summer of 1910, his heart required that he come home from Europe. He wanted to die at Chocorua in New Hampshire, at the farmhouse near the lake and the mountain. He made the crossing, arrived, and died on August 26. He was 68 years old. His brother Henry was with him at the end. Henry James, the great novelist who had spent his life describing the interior of other people's experience from a careful distance, sat beside his brother and held his hand while the philosopher's stream concluded, its run. Henry outlived William by 6 years. He spent some of those years writing his autobiography, which is, among other things, a tribute to a brother who had never learned to be still, and who, in the end, simply was. Chapter 35. What Alice Knew. Alice James's diary was published in 1934, 42 years after her death. It found an audience, though never the wide one it deserved. What Alice understood, lying in her rooms while her brothers travelled and taught and published, was something that William spent his professional life approaching from the outside. What it is actually like to be in a body and mind that will not cooperate, and to be required to perform normalcy from inside that condition. She described the effort of being upright, the effort of conversation, the effort of performing the minimal social functions that Victorian society required. And she described what happened in the hours of the night when no performance was required, when the body could stop managing itself and simply be what it was. She did not find those hours peaceful. The mind, in her experience, did not become quieter when the body stopped. It became louder. Every regret, every frustration, every constraint that daylight activity had kept at a manageable distance, these gathered in the dark. And yet she wrote repeatedly about something she found in the worst of those hours. She called it the something within, a phrase she did not define but trusted enough to use many times, as if pointing at something just beyond the reach of language, a ground beneath the distress, not silence, not peace, but a quality of endurance that was not the same as strength, something that held even when strength was gone. William would have recognized this. It was the same thing he had found in 1870, not resolution, but a deeper flaw beneath the place where the flaw had seemed to end. Let your shoulders drop. Feel the weight beneath you. You are held by something that does not require your effort to hold you. Alice James died in 1892. William read her diary after her death. He wrote to Henry that what she had found in those rooms was more true than anything either of them had written about the experience of being healthy. She had found it by having nothing else. Chapter 36. The stream at the end of the day. James described the stream of consciousness as flowing continuously, but he also noted that it has different qualities at different times. The waking stream is purposive. It moves toward objects. It has direction. It is organized, as Bergson observed, around the needs of action, what to do next, what to prepare for, what to respond to. The stream approaching sleep is different. It begins to lose its purposiveness. The objects it reaches for are less defined. The connections between thoughts become more associative, less logical. Images intrude. The narrative voice of the waking mind becomes intermittent, then quiet, then gone. This is not deterioration. It is transition. It is the stream changing its character as the conditions around it change. James had studied the hypnagogic state, the borderland between waking and sleeping, where images arise unbidden and the control of the waking mind over the direction of experience loosens. He found it philosophically significant. Here was evidence that the stream's character was not fixed but responsive, that the same mind could operate in fundamentally different modes depending on the conditions. Henri Bergson, in his essay on dreams, wrote that sleep is not the absence of mental life, but its transformation. The dreaming mind is not a broken waking mind. It is a different mode of the same system, operating according to different principles, more associative, less constrained, older in its logic. James would have agreed. The stream does not stop, it changes direction. And in the transition, there is a period in which the ordinary distinctions between solved and unsolved, between what is urgent and what can wait, become slightly more permeable. This is not a dangerous condition. It is the condition that the body and the nervous system have been building toward since the last time you rested. You are already in it. Chapter 37, The Watcher and the Watched. There is a distinction James made in his chapter on the self that belongs here. He distinguished between the self as knower, the I, the subject, the one who is having the experience, and the self as known, the me, the object, the collection of everything about oneself that can be observed, evaluated, compared, remembered. Most of the reviewing that happens at night is the me being examined by the I. The things done, the things said, the things owed, these are being turned over by the part of the self that is watching them. The I examines the me. The knower examines the known. But the I itself is never fully examined. It is always the one examining. It stands slightly outside the experience it is looking at, looking in. Every time you try to catch it, you have already moved behind your own view. The one looking is always just slightly ahead of the looking. This watcher, the one observing the stream, not the stream itself, has a quality that the stream does not. It is not swept along by the current. The thoughts move. The moods move. The concerns of the day move through and are replaced by the concerns of the night. The physical sensations shift. The body adjusts, softens, opens toward horizontal. All of this is movement. And the one watching it is not moving. It is not agitated by the agitation. It notices the agitation. It is not dissolved by the fatigue. It notices the fatigue and is not identical to it. This watcher has been here the whole night. Through the names and dates, through the two kinds of tiredness, through the movement of the stream, there has been something in you that was not moving, not disturbed, not requiring resolution. You can sense it. It is the part that is noticing the restlessness rather than the restlessness itself. That part is already quiet. Chapter 38. Attention Revisited, The Watcher's Way. James wrote, in Talks to Teachers on Psychology, a passage that has been widely paraphrased in the centuries since. The core idea, the capacity to bring attention back to its chosen object, repeatedly, quietly, without frustration, is the central psychological discipline of a functioning life. He was not describing meditation. He was describing the daily exercise of a mind that has something to do and keeps returning to it when the stream pulls it elsewhere. But the same capacity applies in the opposite direction, not toward a task, but away from urgency, not toward resolution, but toward the simple fact of the body at rest. The discipline of voluntary attention is the same whether you are directing it toward a problem that needs thinking or toward the awareness of the breath in this moment. The thought that pulls attention away from rest is not more real than the awareness of the body in the bed. It is simply more attention-attracting, louder, more charged, more insistent on its own urgency. The thoughts at this hour have learned, over years of repetition, that this is when they have the best chance of being attended to. The groove is deep. But you have the capacity to bring attention back. You are exercising it right now, with every moment of continued listening. Not because the listening requires tremendous effort, but because the alternative, the loop, the review, the held tension, is simply not where you need to be tonight. Each time attention drifts and is brought back, something small and real happens. The groove deepens slightly in the direction of return. Over time, it becomes easier. Tonight is part of that accumulation. James believed in accumulation. He believed that small acts, repeated, changed the structure of the self. Not the grand gesture, but the daily return. Not the transformation, but the consistency. This is a return, and it is enough. Chapter 39. The Chocorua House. William James's vacation house at Chocorua in the White Mountains of New Hampshire was a clapboard farmhouse near the edge of a lake. Chocorua Mountain was visible from the front windows. He had bought the property in 1886. He went there every summer he could. He walked the paths around the lake in the mornings. He sat on the porch in the evenings, which were cool even in July. He worked in the mornings and rested in the afternoons. He found it the only place where the restlessness he had carried his whole life came close to something that might be called peace. He described the house in his letters as a place where thinking happened more slowly, not less carefully, but with more room between thoughts. He was not lecturing, he was not corresponding at the usual pace. He was watching the lake and thinking, and there was time between the thoughts for each one to settle before the next arrived. This is a small thing. It is also a large thing. The conditions James found at Chocorua, the reduced pace, the absence of urgency, the cool evening air, the particular quality of a mind that has been given room, are not entirely different from the conditions you have right now. The urgency has receded, the pace has slowed, the room is quiet. There is nothing required of you. The difference is that James had the lake and the mountain. You have this. That is enough. The conditions do not need to be beautiful in order to be sufficient. They need only to be quiet enough and dark enough and still enough for the body to find its way. The body knows the way. It has been finding it every night since you were born. Chapter 40, The Philosophy of Enough. James, for all his writing about striving and will and the second wind and the effort of voluntary attention, was also a philosopher of limit. He believed in finitude, not as a defeat, but as a condition. The human self is not infinite. The human capacity for attention is not infinite. The human day is not infinite, and neither is the human life. To live well within these limits, not to transcend them, not to pretend they do not exist, but to live within them with intelligence and some warmth, was, for James, the practical meaning of wisdom. He came to this conclusion not through abstraction, but through his body. By 1905, his heart was giving him serious trouble. By 1907, he knew it was a matter of a few years. He was making the calculation that every older person eventually makes. Which things are still worth the effort, and which things can now be set down? He chose to go to Worcester to hear Freud. He chose to complete the Gifford volume and the Pragmatism lectures. He chose not to finish the systematic philosophy he had been planning because it was too large for the time he had. He was not resigned. He was choosing as he had been choosing since 1870, when the choice was simply to act as if the self were real enough to be worth defending. There is a form of tiredness that is also completeness. Not the exhaustion of having too much remaining, but the weight of a day that held what it could hold and is now genuinely finished. The day you are ending tonight held what it could hold. The unsolved things will be there in the morning, and they will be better met in the morning with a rested mind. If you are in that wait right now, you are in exactly the right place. Chapter 41. The Argument That Ended. In August of 1910, near the end, William James told his wife Alice that he was ready. He had been arguing with reality for 68 years. Not unhappily, he had loved the argument. He had found it productive. The argument had produced the principles of psychology and the varieties of religious experience and pragmatism and 35 years of teaching and thousands of letters and a marriage that had lasted 32 years, and a household where ideas were treated as tools for living, not decorations for thinking. The argument had also, for a period in 1869, almost undone him. He had sat in a cold room and felt the floor disappear beneath what he thought was himself. He had chosen, slowly and without certainty, to believe the floor was still there, and it was. Not the floor he had imagined, not the fixed, solid ground of settled certainty that the depressed mind craves. A different kind of floor. One that gave slightly under weight, that adjusted to the pressure placed on it, that was better understood as a tendency than as a structure. A floor made not of certainty, but of accumulated small returns. He died on the 26th of August 1910 at the house in Chocorua. The lake was visible from where he lay. His brother Henry was there. Henry, who had spent his life describing the interiors of other people's experience from a careful distance, sat next to the philosopher and held his hand while the stream concluded its run. Henry lived 6 more years. He spent some of those years writing his autobiography, which is, among other things, a tribute to a brother who had never known how to be still and who, in the end, simply was. Chapter 42. The Stream at Rest. The stream of consciousness, James argued, does not stop when the person sleeps. What happens is that its character changes. The purposive, object-directed, socially organized flow of waking thought, the stream that moves toward tasks and conversations and decisions, loses its structure. What remains is something older, less organized, and in some ways, more honest. The dreaming mind does not know what time it is. It does not distinguish between things that happened 30 years ago and things that happened this morning. It associates freely, without the logical constraints that govern waking thought. It is, in James's view, the mind operating in its most essential mode, not its highest mode, but its oldest. And before the dream arrives, there is the borderland, the hypnagogic passage, where the images come unbidden, where the narrative voice of the waking self becomes intermittent, where the certainty of the boundary between self and not self becomes a little less certain. This borderland is where you are headed. It does not require your help to arrive. It requires only that you stop actively preventing it, stop maintaining the vigilance that waking life demands. The body knows how to do the rest. James spent his career explaining how the mind works, and what he found after all of it was this: the mind is more trustworthy than it seems. Left to itself, not abandoned, but allowed, it finds the path it needs. You can let it find the path tonight. Chapter 43. What Pragmatism says about this moment. One final turn of the pragmatist idea before the stream completes its change. Pragmatism asks, what works? Not in the abstract, in the conditions actually present. In the conditions actually present, the body horizontal, the room quiet, the day complete, what works is not more thinking. What works is not more reviewing, more planning, more analysis of what has been done and what remains. These are tools that serve their purpose in daylight, when decisions can be made and actions can follow. In the present conditions, what works is something else. It is the slow withdrawal of voluntary effort from the direction of thought. Not suppression, that is still effortful. Withdrawal, the way water withdraws from the banks when the tide changes direction, without drama, without loss. The thoughts that remain are not wrong. They are simply no longer being fed. Attention has moved, slowly, without announcement, toward the body, the breath, the weight, the room, and the thoughts, unattended, begin to lose their urgency. They are still there. They will be there in the morning, if morning is what is needed. But they do not require your presence tonight. James believed that the right action in any situation is the one that best serves the conditions actually present. The cash value of an idea is what it does in the world. The cash value of rest tonight is rest. Chapter 44. The Room on Quincy Street. returning. We began in a cold room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 1869. A young man who could not get out of bed. He had, in that room, every reason to believe that the problem was permanent. He had tried movement. The Brazil expedition had not helped. He had tried study. The medical degree had not resolved anything. He was 27 years old, with a medical license he had not used, and a mind that felt like it was running without traction. He read one French philosopher's careful argument about the will, and he chose not to be cured, not to be immediately well, only to act as if the choice were real for 1 year and see what happened. What happened over the following decade was Harvard and the classroom and the book that took 12 years, and a woman named Alice who read his manuscripts and held the household and the lectures in Edinburgh, and the thousands of letters to people he had never met who wrote to say that something he had written had kept them going. None of it would have happened without the choice. Not the grand choice, not the moment of certainty or revelation or conversion, though he wrote about those, but the small choice, the one made in a cold room on a February morning, with no guarantee of anything because the alternative was to not make it. You have made your version of that choice tonight. You are here. The room is quiet. The wait is real. Chapter 45. The self that was always watching. There is one more thing, James said, that belongs here. The self as knower, the I, the watcher, the one looking in at the stream, has a quality that the stream does not. It is not swept away by the current. The thoughts move, the moods move, the concerns of the day move through and are replaced by the concerns of the night. The physical sensations shift. The body adjusts its position, softens, opens toward horizontal. All of this is movement. And the one watching it is not moving. It is not agitated by the agitation. It notices the agitation. It is not dissolved by the fatigue. It notices the fatigue and allows it. This is not a spiritual claim. James was careful about spiritual claims. It is an empirical observation. When you look for the one who is having the experience, you find something quieter than the experience itself. This watcher has been here the whole time. Through the day's noise and the night's review, through the two kinds of tiredness and the movement of the stream, through the words of this night, there has been something in you that was not moving, not disturbed, not requiring resolution. It is what will remain when the last thought of the night passes through and is not replaced. It is what rest actually is. Chapter 46. The Varieties of this particular night. James wrote in the final pages of The Varieties of Religious Experience that the practical outcome of all his investigation was modest. He did not claim to have proven the existence of God or the immortality of the soul. He did not claim to have resolved the question of free will. He claimed only to have demonstrated that the experiences people described as transformative were real, that they happened, that they changed people, that they could not be dismissed. He was satisfied with this. He had never expected more. Tonight, the varieties of this particular experience are similarly modest. This is not a transformation. This is not a breakthrough. It is a night, one of many, different from some, similar to others, in which the stream has been given a gentle direction, and the body has been given permission to follow where it was already going. The names and ideas that move through this night, the stream of consciousness, the will to believe, the twice born, the habit, the second kind of tiredness, the watcher and the watched, are not solutions. They are companions, ideas to hold lightly, not to press on things that need no pressing. James would have approved of this use of his work. He was not a systematic philosopher who wanted his system applied. He was a man who had found, through difficulty, some things worth knowing, and who spent his life trying to communicate them to people he would never meet. You are one of those people. Chapter 47. The Lake at Chocorua. It is late August. The lake at Chocorua is very still. The mountain behind it is a pale shape against the dark. There is no wind tonight. The reflection of the mountain in the water is as clear as the mountain itself, so clear that for a moment you cannot tell which is the original and which is the reflection, only that they are the same shape and both equally present. William James sat on this porch many evenings. He sat here in August of 1910, in the last weeks of his life, and looked at the lake and the mountain and the shape of the mountain in the water. He had spent his life studying the mind in order to understand what was real. What he found in the end was that the question did not require an answer as much as it required a posture, a way of standing toward the uncertainty that was neither denial nor despair. A way of holding the open question with the same lightness that the lake holds the mountain's reflection. He called this pragmatism. He could have called it trust. The stream flows. The mountain is reflected. The one watching is still. You do not need to resolve anything tonight. The resolution will come or it will not, and it will come in the form that the conditions allow. What you can do is this: allow the conditions. The room is dark, the body is heavy, the thoughts are quieter than they were an hour ago. This is enough. This is, in fact, everything that was needed. Chapter 48. Sleep now. The room in Cambridge, 1869, is empty now. William James is not in it. He went on from there to Harvard, to Alice, to 12 years of writing, to Edinburgh, to Chocorua, to a porch at the edge of a lake where he sat and thought and finally stopped thinking and simply was. The room held him for a season and then released him, the way rooms release everyone who passes through them. The room you are in tonight will do the same. What you carried into it, you can set down here. The weight of the day that is over, the weight of the second kind of tiredness, the self that has been performing and was never given permission to stop. The weight of the things unsolved, and the things reviewed, and the things rehearsed for tomorrow, you can set them here. Not permanently, they will be available in the morning. But for tonight, they do not require your attendance. James chose, in 1870, to believe in the will. He chose to act as if the choice were real. Over decades, the choice rebuilt him. You are making your own version of that choice tonight. Not the grand version, the small one, the one made in the dark with no guarantee, simply because the alternative, the loop, the review, the held tension, is no longer what you need. The stream continues. The watcher is still. The body knows what to do next. One thing worth carrying out of this night: the mind is not wrong for running. It was built to find the path. The only path it needs right now is down and into the dark, and it already knows the way. Sleep now.